that we've decided to diversify our panel by I guess where I want to start is the title of this talk, right? Feminism from below. So conversely, that presents us with another question. What is feminism from above, right? Why is there a need for us to establish a feminism from below at this point in history? Feminism is something that, there's not like one direct lineage, right, going from the suffragettes to now, right? We are always interpreting it through the lens of history. And what do we know about history, right? It tells us more about power relations now than necessarily it does about events as they happened then. So we think about feminism as kind of starting with the suffragettes and being led by bourgeois, white, educated women, right? Then we think of the kind of, maybe in the World War II period, we think a bit of like, Rosie the Riveter, we can do it. Later on in the 60s, again, we think of college-educated, largely white women. Maybe we start thinking a bit about the civil rights era and the women who were involved there. Then, we think of 1970s, radical feminism, again, largely white, largely bourgeois, and then third wave feminism. And what's the thing that we have in common here, right? We're thinking about the experiences and the political contributions in terms of the most privileged women in society, right? I'm talking about material privileges, not just like privileges in terms of social or interpersonal interactions, but just having money, having an education, living in the global north, being cisgender, right? That's not to say that these women don't experience gender depression, right? Far from it, right? And I think that actually we need to even unpick some of our like wokest assumptions about how privilege works. And I want to get to that a little bit towards the end of this kind of opener. But certainly we have to start thinking about actually from the very origins of feminism, right? From the minute you start thinking about what it means to be a liberated woman, you have the organization of countless nameless working class women, trans women or gender non-conforming people, right? You have the contributions of those who have existed under slavery or colonialism, right? You've got those who organize under the umbrella of black radicalism, right, or trade unions, right? So you have a feminist history from below as well as the need to organize a feminism from below today. But I think I'd like to introduce some problems, right? So one is, how do you have a unified experience of femininity and gender depression without imposing a homogeneity, right? Imposing a sameness, and also erasing the kinds of power dynamics and oppressive dynamics that exist. So for example, we might think about the mistress of the house under like plantation slavery, right? Does she experience the same kind of gender depression as an enslaved African woman, for instance? No, right? Did she benefit from that racialized exploitation? Yes. Does it mean that she did not experience gender depression within, say, marriage? No, it doesn't, right? So how do you make sense of, right, these contrasting, conflicted histories? I offer that as a question rather than offering a response. The other thing that I might think about is that when we think about the kind of canonical feminist text, right, so from the female eunuch to the feminine mystique, right, again, focusing on largely cisgender bourgeois white women, right, it's appealing to an experience of femininity, right, and a construction of womanhood, which owes a lot to racism, right? And I would argue that the category of women that we see today is impossible without racism. And I'm going to kind of maybe, if it's okay, do a little bit of historical groundwork about why I'm saying this, right? It's because in the 18th and 19th centuries, when you really have this, in the UK, you really have this idea of separate spheres of, right, domestic labour for women, the world of work for men. That's the product of essentially colonialism and capitalism. You certainly don't get capitalism without colonial exploitation and indeed the profits of slavery, right? So when you have this idea of the angel of the house, right, which is a really shit Victorian poem, which I really don't encourage you to read, it's rubbish. It's basically like this guy who writes a love poem for his wife being like, you're so great, I love you, you do all the cooking and the cleaning, and you never talk back to me, and your mother raised you this way, and she was an angel of the house, and you're raising your daughter this way, and you're great, I love you, and don't talk, please don't talk, right? This figure is only possible, right, because one, you've got the Industrial Revolution, which you've got sharpening of differences in terms of men go out to work, women stay at home. Two, you're a bourgeois woman, right, you don't have to go out to work, right? And three, the commodities available to you, right? The food available to you, the kind of exploitation of labour in home in terms of servants, the stuff that you've got in terms of like sugar, coffee, right? This is all the product of the colonies, right? Do you think that women were angels of the house in the colonies, right? Women existed under colonialism? No, right? They weren't. They were, literally labouring to produce these commodities, right? And this figure of the angel of the house, right? We see again, right, in feminine mystique in terms of the 1950s housewife. And I'm not saying they don't experience gender depression, but this idea of like a category of female experience, right, is kind of inflected by these other forms of power and modes of production that I think we really do need to make sense of. So the solution often to this is often known as intersectionality, right? The acknowledgement that there is not one feminine experience or gendered experience, but many, right? So you're not just a woman, right, and the kind of unacknowledged whiteness that entails, but you are a woman of colour, right, or you are a Muslim woman of colour, or a black Muslim woman of colour, right, or you're trans, or you're a lesbian, or whatever, right? But I'm going to be a bit annoying and kind of point out some problems with intersectionality, right? Because I've got nothing constructive to offer. I'm just like, I have a lot of questions. Right. This is the problem with spending too much time on the internet. It's like, I have no solutions for you. Very sorry. But my problem with intersectionality, and by the way, I think it's a great teaching tool, right? And I think it's a really important activism tool, is that I think it's a faulty analysis, right? So, sorry, I was really into the over-the-knee boots as well. I was just so glad that someone else, thank you. So glad someone else made that choice. This model of the crossroads, right? It treats oppressions as existing separately in history until they intersect at the level of the individual, right? So you've got gender running along this way, you've got race running along this way, and here they are intersecting at the level of the individual. But are we not always talking about race when we're talking about gender, even when we're talking about white women? Are we not always talking about gender when we're talking about race, right? Who gets included in a model of, say, fragile femininity or hypersexualized femininity, and who gets excluded from the category of the woman who needs to be protected, right? How do you move to the woman who needs to be policed, whether you're a woman of colour or you're undocumented or you're a Muslim woman, etc., right? Are we not always talking about sexuality, right? And are we not always talking about queerness, even when we're looking at the experiences of cisgender heterosexual women, right? Like, you've always got the kind of inverse or obverse or kind of, fragmented version, right, of the, exalted or powerful identity, right? Like, kind of carried through the whole time, right? We're always talking about race, gender, sexuality, even when we're talking about straight white men. So that's my problem with intersectionality. However, what I think it is great for is when you're in spaces like this, right? And this is where feminism is meaningful, right? They say the personal is political for a reason, right? Gendered relations are reproduced through institutions, yes, but also through our interpersonal, everyday interactions. And that's where intersectionality is really fucking great, right? Like, it's a way of explaining different kinds of, experiences which are inflected by power dynamics and making yourself legible to other people, right? And, giving people a kind of critical distance from their own positions of power. So I think that's really useful. I think it's crucial, but I think that it shouldn't, feminist theory doesn't stop with Kimberly Crenshaw, right? And Kimberly Crenshaw herself does not call herself an intersectional feminist. She calls herself a black feminist, right? Difference, right? And I sometimes find it quite funny when I'm on Twitter and I see lots of white women with intersectional feminists in their bios, and I'm a bit like, cool. What's intersecting? Okay, cool. But I'm not that picky about it. It's just kind of internal lol. And I guess where I'd then kind of finish is that what's feminism from above? Feminism from above never really existed, right? Feminism from above is the co-option and the integration of counter-hegemonic discourses, narratives, and ideas into the reproduction of power itself, right? And then what I think feminism from below does, the feminist reading of history from below does, is makes itself unco-optable. And you do it by shattering hypocrisy and co-option wherever it is you may find it. So when you say, look, what you think of as a universal experience of gender depression isn't that, because I also experience racism, because I also experience Islamophobia, because I also experience queer phobia or transphobia, right? And to say like, and this is intersectional, that's not to say that your experience isn't valid, but that this is kind of the character of mine. I think intersectionality is great as a social learning tool, right? Where I think it's not so good is where we use it as a tool with which we analyze society, right? So rather than it being something which helps us along in our interpersonal interactions, when we start using it as a, the framework for our analysis, and go, this is how society works, right? You kind of have these abstract oppressions, right, which exist and kind of trundle through history until they intersect at the level of an individual, right? That's my beef with it. So we need to look at, your suburban white Tory voting housewife, right, who say doesn't have access to, a joint bank account or whatever, right, and, has a very typical model of, gender depression that's kind of in line with our like feminine mystique oppressed housewife model. We need to look at that as a product of racist exploitation as much as a gendered one, right? It's not that we have suddenly deducted race from it because she is white, right? Like the character of whiteness has structured that experience. Similarly, and basically what I'm saying is that like racism isn't based on, it's not the product of difference, right? Actually, how we think of difference is based on racism, right? And so that's the thing, is that like, racism wasn't the product of when white people met black people, right? Racism invented white people and black people, right? It created these categories. So that's what I mean by thinking about things in a much more integrated historical way, which doesn't treat these things as separate. The thing is that we can't abstract these words from activist histories, and that's why I was really interested in what you had to say. Thinking about the kinds of spaces from which terminology emerges, right? Terminology doesn't happen in the space of the academy, right? It's not like, you go away, you think for a bit, and you're like, guys, I cracked it, done, problem solved. But like, you think about queer feminism, right? It doesn't, it's not the invention of Judith Butler. It comes from, it comes from queer activists who are, again, like it's about proximity to the politics of survival, right? Like think about the kind of advances made by like decolonial feminism, right? Or black feminism, or indeed Muslim feminism, right? And it's not about the label. It's not like you read it in the abstract like, hey, I'm this thing. And the meaning doesn't come from like the invention of the word, but it's appealing to, I think, a history of concrete struggle. So for me, it's not about finding an alternative word to intersectionality, but looking for spaces or histories of social organisation that I find inspiring or nourishing or fun. Like crazy, went on for weeks of the most violent, racist misogyny I'd ever experienced in my life, and it got to the point where my two best mates basically took my phone off me and my laptop off me and put the boxing on the telly and like gave me a bottle of rum, and they were like, you are not engaging with the internet, like this is bad for you. And when people were asking me, how are you doing? I was like, yeah, it's fine. It doesn't bother me at all. Right? Not true. Not true. Right? And I thought that the response, that I had to be as tough as the abuse was violent. And I mean, I've never spoken about this in public before, so sorry if I'm not being particularly fluent. That in itself was a form of psychological violence, and I now see how I'd imposed that model on other people, right? Where it was, meant in the spirit of love, but it was like toughen up, and actually it drives you crazy. It drives you crazy. And again, this isn't something that like I've ever spoken publicly about, but I wasn't eating. I stopped, as a way of trying to exercise some control over my life. I'd done this before when I was younger and came back in a big way. I wasn't eating. And I thought, if I tell people about this, I'm not a feminist anymore. Because I've read Fat as a Feminist Issue, I've read The Beauty Myth, I've read about racist constructions of beauty. I'm too white for a fucking eating disorder. Right? So I've never spoken about this before, ever. Like, and it's because you made this point about vulnerability. The best thing we can do as feminist activists is create spaces where those who have to be tough all the fucking time, like, can experience some softness, some tenderness, and some love. Like, love and vitalism, I think, are the two most important organizing principles that we have, right? And this isn't fluffy, this isn't hippy-dippy bullshit, fucking hippies. But Asata Shakur, right, talks about the seriousness of love, right? Love is what you have in, this, it takes you from surviving to living, right? From merely clinging on to your pulse and your heartbeat to having a life, right? To giving you a reason to get up in the morning, to keep fighting. She wrote about it in terms of, FBI surveillance, the brakes getting cut. She was like, it made us serious about our love for one another. Kind of looping back to this point about vulnerability. We create spaces in which we can be vulnerable, not so that we can fall apart, not so we can dissimulate into atoms and dissipate and just cry all the time, but so that we can actually be strong and have a strength that's built on something that's real and inside and not hollow and not fronting, right? As a woman of colour, you have to front all the fucking time. I'm tired of it. Practical advice is, how do you do rad shit and get people to listen? How do you do rad shit and not be demonized or treated as fringe or whatever? And the experience that I'm speaking from here is from over the summer and in September, a group of wonderful activists, UK Black Lives Matter, Black-led, Black organised, like Black envisioned, did two huge actions. One shutting down 4 major transport connections across the country, and the next was shutting down London City Airport, just around the corner from here. My involvement with this was not envisioning the action, and it certainly wasn't the political direction of the group. It was very much Black-led. But what I could do was PR, essentially, right? Arranging and wrangling press, trying to get the most favourable coverage possible. How me and a friend of mine who actually teaches one of you, prepared for this was by watching loads of the thick of it. We had never done this before, right? And so, like, this is lesson 1, right? There are no experts in activism. You create your own expertise. Like, decide to do something, get together with your mates, people who you trust, do the shit, fuck up, learn, try better, fail again, do better next time, right? We watched loads of the thick of it. And so we called the act of press wrangling, right, of contacting reporters and, challenging them over coverage and trying to leverage, favourable coverage. So, we got people across every major, news network. We pushed the Olympics opening ceremony, off the news almost entirely. It was dope. Was literally by doing what we called Malcolm Tuckering, right, and then Malcolm Tucker Xing, because, anti-racism. I have a huge ladder in my toes, Jesus. Don't do that. So what we did was seize the agenda, right? The action was of a size which meant that it had to be covered. It was a surprise, it came out of nowhere, right? We tipped off just the right number of journalists, right? People who we already trusted, but leveraged access, right? Access to the action, access to spokespeople against studio time, right? And once you get someone in the studio, and you've got someone who's well prepped, right? And media training is something which you can, reach out to already established activist groups for, right? You can become that confident badass. Don't leave it to Owen Jones, right? You can do it, right? A lot of practice, the way we schooled people and prepared them for media was locking them in my friend's bedroom with me yelling at them for 2 hours, right? Drilling over again, practice, right? Get them in the studio, and you will wipe the floor with whatever joker they put you up against, right? Practical advice. And in terms of messaging, how do you get the message across, right? You need 2 things. You can't have one without the other. Stats and stories, right? Journalists are lazy, and I say this because I'm a lazy journalist myself, right? And they're also overworked, there's that, but fundamentally lazy. They don't want a fact check. They want a story with a bow on it. So give them the stats, pre-fact checked, and you fucking cite it like an essay in every press release, right? And they'll still call you up panicking, saying, is it true that this? And it's like, yes, it's true, right? So be your worst critic when it comes to fact checking. But stats alone don't sell a story. They don't sell a narrative. So you want one or two hard-hitting emotional examples with great visuals, right? Tell the story, allocate time, and really fucking sell it like with your eyes and your voice, commit to it, right? And then you've got 5 minutes of like packaged television, right? An article which, like, despite like the best efforts of journalists and editors who are out to screw you, will come out favourably. We got the whole country, at least for a day, talking about black deaths in police custody when they weren't before, right? That's how you seize an agenda. Got the whole country talking about the racialised aspects of climate change after one action, right? The action isn't enough without the messaging is nothing without the action, right? But let me tell you, this was run on a fucking skeleton crew, right? You can do it with your mates, and that's the advice that I would give you.